Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Stay at Home. This is number 40 something. I don't even know anymore. Obviously, it's middle of the quarantine, so the days are all blurring together. I'm at least finally back at the Jacobin office in complete isolation here. But I did finally get my hands on the new print issue of Jacobin. I haven't seen it in the flesh yet. It looks even better in person, so please subscribe to Jacobin. We have a great lineup next week. Starting on Monday, we have Eileen Jones, Connor Kilpatrick doing a little talk on the future of the film industry and TV in coronavirus, how coronavirus is affecting things and why you should care. And then, we have Rama Vasudevan talking on Wednesday about how the Fed's policy in this crisis is actually bolstering the power of finance capital. So surprise, surprise. Then on Friday, I don't even know what we have lined up on Friday, but I'm sure it's very good. And obviously every Saturday we have weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. The guest for this Saturday is Matt Karp, Jacobin contributing editor, Princeton professor, resident researcher, and Bernie bro for the Jacobin family. So that one should be really good. That's at 1 p.m. Eastern time. Today, we're joined by Jacobin's Europe editor, David Broder. David is extremely prolific. Actually, I found out that our first interactions happened around 11 years ago when we had a testy exchange about like the class nature of the Bolivarian Revolution or something like that, when he was the writer for another publication. And I won't even plug it because I don't want people to. I'm sure David doesn't want to deep dive into that period. But anyway, he's Jacobin's Europe editor now. I'm not sure who's become more of a reformist. Probably we both have in some way, but he's a prolific translator and writer. He has a new book coming out on Bastille Day with Verso Books. And today he's here to talk about one of the most important political parties in the history of the workers' movement, the Italian Communist Party. So a lot of people obviously know the Italian Communist Party because of Antonio Gramsci and because of its theoretical contributions to Gramsci to Marxist thoughts. But in fact, this was the party that terrified the US establishment, terrified NATO. This was a party that at its peak had over 2 million members. At its peak in the 1970s, I think it was 74 or 76, it got 34% of the vote, which is around 12 million people voting for the Italian Communist Party deputies. And it really looked like it was on the verge of taking power. Then obviously it had a equally rapid fall, transforming into what's now barely even a party of the center left, and the Democrats in Italy. And obviously its radical splinter, or the kind of portion that stayed true to the Italian Communist Party, Rifondazione, is also non-existent now. So David's going to talk about this somewhat depressing history, but he's going to talk about the lessons it has for us today, how we should interpret Italian communism. Was it just another variant of social democracy? Did it have more radical seeds than that? It's a really interesting topic. So please, listen to David for 30 minutes. Please press like, press subscribe. That's how the video gets to more people. And please do put your questions in the comments. I'll try to get to at least some of them after David's done speaking. And I forgot to mention it before, but the name of David's book that's out on Bastille Day is First They Took Rome, How the Populist Right Conquered Italy. So also check out that. But without further ado, thank you so much, David. I know it's late there in Rome, but I appreciate you doing this, and I look forward to the talk.
Yeah, well, thanks, Bhaskar. Indeed, it is midnight here in Rome, so I'll start by saying why I think it's important to be up so late talking about the Italian Communist Party. Of course, one of the big reasons is simply what Bhaskar said in terms of the size of the PCI. It is, alongside France, the one Western country where the communists created the dominant force of the left, of the labor movement, for the whole period from the 1940s till the 1990s. So, if we say the PCI had 2 million members in the early 50s, that's a bit like if there was a Communist Party in the USA, which had 13 million members relative to population, whereas the real Communist Party USA probably was a bit closer to 13,000. But also, of course, the interest of the Italian Communist Party owes a lot to its theoretical development and to its particular approach to organization. Of course, a lot of that centers on the figure of Antonio Gramsci, also because he's been sort of picked up and used by forces from across the political spectrum, various kind of forms of liberalism and postmodernism, also by the far right and not just on the left. At the same time, there's a certain foreign interest in the perspective the Italian Communist Party developed in the 70s and 80s, called Eurocommunism, pioneered by the leader at the time, Enrico Berlinguer, which basically proposed a kind of communism that wasn't bound to Moscow, which sought a sort of democratic way forward rather than a sort of 1917 style revolution, but which also sought to unite communism with other sort of liberal and social democratic elements of the European left. So with retrospect, and particularly after 1991, and as Bhaskar said, its transformation into a liberal centrist party modeled on the US Democrats, it's quite easy to sort of point to a certain link between all these stages, from Gramsci to Togliatti, the leader in the 40s to 60s, then to Eurocommunism, and then the ultimate demise. So, kind of like an Italian version of social democracy, ultimately ending up as something not very different from the neoliberal centre-left in other countries. But I think that the PCI is a lot more than that, and is also a lot more than just Gramsci and Eurocommunism. So what I'd like to do basically, and what I've done in my research since I've been interested in the Italian left, basically the last 10 years, is to look more at the kind of variety of different tendencies and pressures within the PCI, in a sense, the roads not taken, but also, even if we don't draw a positive assessment of the PCI's entire record, I think there's lots of elements of its organizational practice which really do offer insights and lessons which we can actually draw on today. Of course, the party's history has lots of sort of beautiful moments of struggle and heroism to admire, from Gramsci's time in prison, the party's leading role in the resistance in World War II, the struggle against the mafia in Sicily, and these kind of things. But I think beyond just romanticizing moments of militancy and suffering, there's also lessons from the party building experience itself, which are really valuable if we're talking about how to do transformative socialist politics in liberal democratic countries. So my plan in this talk is to break those lessons down into three main sections, which I'll talk about in turn. First is the PCI's idea of the mass party. So not just a vanguard of communist militants that support labor struggles or intervene in explosive social movements, but a party that gradually builds its own organized roots in the everyday life of massive people. Second, and connected to that, is the PCI's project of building a counter-hegemonic culture, or possibly hegemonic culture for society as a whole, from its most highbrow kind of academic output, to sort of low-level, sort of local organizing of farm workers and factories and so on. It cultivated a broad vision of society and of its own values, rooted in its tradition, but also projected to the future and claiming for something different from liberal democracy. But if those might sound like positive lessons, the mass party rooted in everyday life, and then the idea of building an alternative set of values, something much more transformative than social democracy. But if those are positive elements of the PCI's history, this was also drastically insufficient, and the PCI not only failed in the sense of meeting obstacles it couldn't overcome to carrying out a sort of transformation of Italian society, but actually became something much worse, as Pascal alluded to. It became a centrist and liberal force, or at least part of one, and indeed a party which has basically entirely separated from its working class base and history. So I think it's also worth going into the specific reasons for why that can happen. Okay, so firstly, well, when I say that the PCI is a mass party, I don't just mean that it had lots of members or sought to get the masses to follow it. Rather, it's a specific term that Palmiro Togliatti, its leader from, in fact, the late 1920s until his death in 1964, used to characterize his vision of how it should organize. The party hadn't emerged this way. In Italy, the Communist Party, like in many of its sister parties, emerged from a split in the socialists. I believe we've actually got a silent film which illustrates this happening. Do we have that, Cal? Maybe not. Okay, so so the historic Socialist Party was built around a patchwork of local sections, usually meaning that some local leader would decide what happened, including in terms of its sort of haphazard electoral alliances and pacts it entered into, and then the general membership wouldn't have much say. So although it had a broad promise of a socialist society in the future, its organizational effectiveness was very low. It wasn't a centralized force. It wasn't able to intervene in big moments of national crisis, like World War I, the strike wave following the war, and so on. So broadly inspired by the Russian example, the Communist Party, founded in 1921, was instead premised on being a party of cadres, so led by Amadeo Bordiga. This vanguard accepted openly its minoritarian character. It wasn't united by the democratic decision by the majority of members, or still less by the sort of fads of working class opinion, what working people in general think. Rather, it had a fixed program, and the idea was that this would eventually allow it to seize some moment of revolutionary opportunity. This party was meant to be galvanized by unbending principle, but fared very poorly in the face of mounting fascism. And Bordiga was arrested in 1923, and after that he was rapidly marginalized by the center of the party, led by Gramsci and Palmiro Togliatti. It's easy to sort of project the later differences onto the original moment of divergence, but essentially the clash that developed over time was that Gramsci and Togliatti placed emphasis on building workplace cells and working class education, and they characterized Bordiga's cadre-based approach as mechanical and passive, essentially waiting for the opportunity to come rather than building organization proactively. Added to that, the development of fascism coincided with the centralization of the Communist International, and over the 1920s, also with Gramsci in prison, Togliatti became the effective leader of a party which was now basically a community of exiles and prisoners, dependent on the Communist International rather than its membership for its continued existence, financial support, and so on. But although the Communist Party, therefore, very early in its development, within just 5 years of its foundation, became a clandestine and really mainly an exile party. In a paradoxical way, this actually helped it to overcome some of the worst effects that Stalinism had on communist parties in other countries. If we think of parties like the French or German or British communist parties, in the French and German case also being large or mass parties at the time, they had to basically follow the to's and fro's of Stalinist foreign policy. They carried out very public purges of their own membership. And sort of even before the Second World War, therefore sort of managed to project a certain sectarian image. In the Italian case too, there were purges, there was exclusions and so on, including of Bordiga, the founder. Yet this basically happened in exile, wasn't very visible to militants or indeed the working class population of Italy generally. And this allowed the Communist Party leaders, exactly the same clandestine and exiled leaders who did enjoy the favor of the Stalinist Comintern, the fact that they've been illegal for so long, basically from 26 till 1943, that kind of at the moment of the resistance, this upswing of activity of democratic anti-fascist mobilization, that helped them to project a more open image because they were effectively creating a new party in the towns and villages around Italy. So they were integrating local forces that had emerged separately of their control, young intellectuals who were like more interested in anti-fascism and the Popular Front than in the socialist end goal as such. So all that created quite a variety of different social forces all merging into the Communist Party at the same time. Giorgio Amendola, who was one of the leaders of the party at the time, the son of a Liberal MP, called it like the boiling magma, which the party would channel into something solid. This contradiction is also something Eric Hobsbawm notes in terms of Antonio Gramsci and his reception in Italy. Remember, of course, that the prison notebooks weren't actually, obviously weren't actually published at the time they were written because they were written in prison. So they began to appear in an abridged edition in 1947, and basically their kind of popularization at the level of people who didn't like directly read them mainly took place through Togliatti himself. So the contradiction there is kind of like, although Gramsci pointed to the existence of a distinctly Italian and democratic Marxism, that was only possible because basically Moscow trusted Togliatti to hold the line in general, and he had more or less complete mastery over the party organization. Beyond that, the PCI was absolutely the predominant organizational force in the anti-fascist resistance. So in organizing factory strikes, because of its particularly strong commitment to the armed struggle, probably about 60% of all partisans in the resistance were in PCI organized units. And whether or not they were really had developed communist kind of consciousness, the PCI was the place to be if you wanted to be active in the resistance. At the same time as the prestige of the Soviet Union, this helped the PCI develop massively organizationally from a few tens of thousands of clandestine members in the resistance to, by the end of the 1940s, becoming a genuinely mass party, like 2 million members. At the same time, as I said, with what Amendola said about the idea of the boiling magma or lava, this all had to be made into party organization, something that would be enduring and not just sort of reflect an episodic upsurge of revolt. The PCI's approach to this certainly wasn't to create a big open tent democratic organization where everyone could say what they like and stand for what they like. That wasn't at all the case. The PCI didn't have internal factions or didn't have open clashes over its policy platform. In fact, even in a much later period than what I'm talking about now, even in, like, say, the late 60s, if you look at some of the members of the party who were critical of, say, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in '68, they were basically expelled, or at least pushed out, forming what became known as Il Manifesto newspaper. But even though the PCI tended to avoid public dispute, that didn't mean it was just a rigid bureaucracy or that it was incapable of representing kind of different strands or people from different political backgrounds. At the same time, perhaps more important than the question of formal democracy, at least among a lot of its membership, was the fact that it provided a means by which working class people could have a political voice, which they never would have otherwise, particularly not in the fascist era when there was no space for politics at all, but nor into pre-fascist liberal Italy. And the PCI of the 50s is an incredible example of the power of people from even the most modest backgrounds and with the least formal education to assume leadership roles in political organization. So to take a couple of the most prominent examples, Giuseppe Di Vittorio, who is the main leader of the CGIL, the biggest trade union federation, he had basically abandoned or been forced to stop going to school aged 9 to work full-time as a farm laborer. Pietro Secchia, who was the sort of leader of a more leftist tendency in the party, but in the leadership, he was the editor of its daily newspaper, L'Unità, despite the fact that he'd been forced to abandon formal education at age 13 to work in a tannery. These were both, Vittorio and Secchia were both figures from the kind of 1920s generation, but the resistance itself also saw a lot of these new kind of leaders from very modest backgrounds coming to the forefront of public life, becoming local PCI leaders, MPs, this kind of thing. Added to this, the PCI created an incredible life around its sections, like its local branches, often meaning a building, and the networks of its cooperatives and labor organizations it led. So this wasn't just a kind of community of activists or going for a drink with the comrades after a meeting or watching a Jacobin webcast, but rather it was about it wasn't limited to formal political activity. It was just like social spaces which the party owned or ran. So in his book, The Tailor of Ulm, at the end we'll mention we'll sort of bring up a list of the books I mentioned. In The Tailor of Ulm, Lucio Magri said, spoke of the PCI's life. He said, in the evening you went to a meeting on your bicycle or moped where you discussed the newspaper articles or membership campaign. Then you'd come back late to eat a plate of tripe or have a drink or two at the cafe attached to the House of Labour. This being in the Italy of the 1950s, where eating tripe was seen as a good thing. Okay, so apart from the PCI sort of roots in building its party organization in everyday life, even social spaces, even not formally political aspects of its activity, the PCI sought to build a counter-hegemonic worldview, or indeed a worldview that could potentially become hegemonic, become like the organizing principles of national life and national politics. In the resistance, it had allied with socialists, liberals, Christian Democrats, even monarchists in the name of anti-Nazism. But more than that, it had helped write the new democratic constitution in 46 to 47. This document's first line, after much haggling, declared Italy a democratic republic founded on labor and denounced socio-economic impediments to workers' full participation in democratic life. So the point isn't that these were really things realized in post-war Italian society, but rather it's that the PCI managed to get these kind of ideas into the national constitution and could always sort of point to this saying, well, the resistance achieved this constitution, now let's go out and realize it. So as well as being a party of opposition, it could also kind of lay claim to an institutional legitimacy and values that were its own, but also it hardwired or supposedly into the constitution of the state. The contradiction here was that the PCI was never actually in national government from 1947 onwards, as throughout the whole Cold War period, the state was dominated by Christian Democrats, at least at the national level. The Catholic hierarchy excommunicated the communists, which certainly mattered in Italy. Kel, if we can bring up the poster from the 1948 elections. I can't see if we have that up, but maybe you can see it. But basically in the 1948 elections, the Christian Democrats produced posters saying, in the secrecy of the voting booth, God can see you, Stalin can't. So to say to the Catholic communist workers, you better watch out. At the same time, there's vicious propaganda against the communists for wanting to break up the family, even for claims of cannibalism of babies in the Soviet Union, this kind of thing. At the same time, this wasn't just nasty words, because in the 1950s, there was a very sharp bosses counter-offensive against, say, farm worker organizing. In southern Italy in particular, several instances where workers were killed, whether by police, by mafiosi, and so on. So in this sense, we start to see some of the different souls of the PCI, because for some militants, particularly those who struggled to accept the alliances of the war period, the PCI basically, although it claimed to be democratic, their kind of hope was that ultimately it was just a stage on the path to the eventual moment when the party could take up arms and really seize power. So when there was an assassination attempt against Togliatti in 1948, lots of partisans in the hundreds or low thousands, let's say, literally dug up their weapons and paraded around in the streets because they thought perhaps the moment had come for the final confrontation. At the same time, the need to respond to the kind of bosses counterattack that I mentioned meant that for many of the PCI really was the defender of Italian democracy or upholding a constitution yet to be realized. But probably the overarching theme, and which in a way was able to combine these different moods, and as I say, these are different sort of souls or different aspirations for what the party could be. They're not really like different factions. There's no like public debate. The thing that unites them is the idea that Italy's political structures were backward and beholden to an underdeveloped bourgeoisie or even pre-capitalist landlord elements, and that the PCI would eventually carry forward a sort of democratic and modernizing revolution in Italy. This could be combined even with a Leninist and pro-Soviet approach. So famously in the 1957 election campaign, the Communist Party canvassed for votes used the image Sputnik, the Soviet satellite, basically saying that socialism was the harbor of modernity. The PCI wasn't narrowly workerist in culture, but rather sought to rally a much more diverse set of Italians, like artisans, farmers, small business owners, women in general, around a shared vision of industrial modernity, of which sort of blue-collar workers were certainly a pivotal and symbolic element, but not the only one. And in a sense, you could say that the success of Togliatti's leadership was that the PCI could talk to different kinds of militants and different levels of activist involvement all at once. So whether it was the dance down the local section or just the sort of dignity or perhaps material advances that workers won through day-to-day democratic organizing, or the utopian horizon, the sun of the future shining towards the present, the PCI was kind of all of these things at once. And under Togliatti's leadership, and particularly because the party was permanently in opposition, it was very well able to marry all of these things together, in a sense being many things to many people. But I think it's here also that we begin to see the limitations of the PCI's approach. Certainly the idea of modernization could hardly summarize all that was wrong with Italian society. In the 1950s and 60s, Italy, in fact, enjoyed faster economic growth than almost anywhere, the exceptions of Japan and West Germany, as it went through its so-called economic miracle and did indeed become a modern industrialized economy. In fact, in the 1980s, Italy would overtake Britain for GDP per capita. So it's a very limited and partial understanding to imagine that Italy is somehow just this like peripheral and backward country, or certainly taken as a whole, and that the task of the left would be reducible to some sort of completing of the bourgeois democratic revolution. That said, it is true that Italy's democratic system, and particularly its role in NATO and the Cold War order, prevented there being an exchange of power. So whereas in most liberal democracies by this point in the 20th century, there was effectively some sort of Labour Party or Social Democratic Party, and then a middle class or Conservative Party, and they would periodically exchange the reins of government without that sort of profoundly undermining their constitutional stability. Italy didn't have this. And nor, in fact, in the first couple of post-war decades did France. So if we look at May 68 in France, much like the social movements of Italy in the late 60s and 1970s, part of the reason why those movements are so strong and militant, and why they give rise to new sort of far-left forces advocating a frontal clash with the state, is that the reformist kind of approach, which, as they saw it, the communist parties were offering, wasn't making any headway, because basically there was no centre-left. There were governments called the centre-left, where the Christian Democrats had socialists in the government as kind of subordinate partners, but there were never like left-wing governments or governments by workers' parties as such. That said, at the electoral level, the PCI certainly was making progress. It increased its score in every national contest from 1948 until 1976, continually firming up its base and building ever further in a long and incremental march. Much unlike, if we think of, like, say, the Labour Party in the last general election lost like 8% of its vote in one go, something very common of social democratic parties recently. The PCI, even for it to have lost 2 or 3%, would have been considered like a disastrous defeat, because it would have fundamentally undermined its strategic premise, which is that of a gradual march towards the majority. And in fact, even in the 80s, even up till 1991, the Communist Party's election results were still well into the, above 30%. It never really suffered any sort of electoral collapse. But even though the PCI certainly had a strategy focused on a role in Republican institutions, that didn't mean it was well prepared for national government. This problem particularly came to a head precisely at the moment of its greatest successes. So after, in the early 70s, from 1970, it had started to take over control of some regional governments. But in 1976, it scored 34% in a general election, which put it only a couple of points behind the Christian Democrats. The problem is that this came only 3 years after the coup d'etat in Chile. So Salvador Allende, his Socialist Party, had led a Popular Front, which had basically secured 51% of the vote, then faced massive, in fact, less than that, but it had 51% of seats in Congress. Then it faced massive destabilization and had been overthrown in a military coup. And this in a country with much stronger democratic traditions than Italy. So basically, the lesson Berlinguer took from this was that there was no chance of the PCI ever managing to get a sort of slight majority coalition, and that it should instead seek to enter the mainstream more gradually through a pact with Christian democracy called the Historic Compromise. So from 1976 to 1979, the communists provided outside support in various ways for Christian democratic governments. But what it certainly didn't manage to do was push these administrations in a different direction politically. In fact, given the influence of liberal economists, even on important leaders of the party like Giorgio Amendola, and the lack of built-up experience in government in terms of forming like a sort of cadre of technocrats or figures able to give sort of substantive public policy, the Communist Party instead proved pretty weak in terms of providing any sort of economic indications. A problem greatly exacerbated by both the oil shock of 1973 and a wider crisis of Keynesianism internationally. This isn't just a story of betrayals by bad leaders. Rather, the crisis owed to the very thing that had made the PCI strong to begin with, its strategic ambiguity and the detachment between its day-to-day tactics and the strategic end goal. And here came into full view the no man's land, which ought to have been filled by plans for institutional transformation. In particular, in this period of Euro-communism, the turn away from the Soviet model, the critique of Christian democratic corruption, and so on. In fact, what was rising in the party was a rising anti-statist disposition and a dismissal of the idea that state planning, or even what the party called democratic programming, something a bit like Gaullist dirigism, like choosing leading sectors of the economy and so on, all of that kind of discourse was on a downward spiral. Instead, what came to dominate in communist discourse, including with regard to the government of the Christian Democrats, was the so-called moral question and what Berlinguer himself called austerity. By that, he meant something short of what we now mean by this term in terms of slashing budgets and breaking up public services and so on. But even so, it did internalize the idea of belt tightening, or at least the idea that workers should put their wage demands on halt in the interests of national competitiveness, and basically like helping the economy weather the storm. And so in the late 1970s, as indeed in the 1990s, after the party changed its name to become an openly social democratic force, even in 1978, communist-aligned union leaders openly accepted wage freezes in the interests of combating inflation and maintaining Italy's place in the European monetary system. The politics of sacrifices now for gains in future, which never actually came. In the historic compromise period, the PCI's leftist critics often accused it of being aspirant managers of Italian capitalism. But perhaps the problem was that the PCI weren't really planning to manage it at all, even in a reformist sense. Rather than being a hegemonic force that could impose itself on the government, the PCI began to be hegemonized by an incipient neoliberal project advocated by post-Keynesian economists like Franco Modigliani, which made its full breakthrough in the early 1990s. As I say, this wasn't just a case of bad leaders. At the same time, there was sort of developing a crisis in the traditional bases of PCI organization. Up till Berlinguer's death in 1984, all PCI leaders were cadres from the World War II generation, and the gradual withdrawal of this generation from the front line of public life went some way to ungluing the various souls of the party who'd been united by this foundational experience. Moreover, not only was the socialist horizon drifting further away, in particular due to the crisis in the Eastern Bloc, but organized labor at big workplaces like Fiat, symbolic of the Italian labor movement, had undergone heavy defeats. So after Berlinguer's death in 1984, the question of the party's communist identity entered into total crisis. In this sense, Berlinguer's death was sort of the end of several overlapping eras, if we consider the influence of the resistance generation on the party, the strength of the post-war labor movement, and in terms of the idea that the Soviet Union represented not even a future socialist society, but even a society that could endure without drastic repression. Indeed, while there were over 2 million people at Berlinguer's funeral in June 1984, and a few days later, the Communist Party actually won a national election, the European election, for the first time. this was rather a swan song rather than pointing to future expansion. In fact, when Berlinguer was dead and out of the way, and the party had to deal with the failure of reform efforts in the Soviet Union, it actually very quickly moved away from anything approaching a communist identity, transforming not into a reformist and socialist party, as perhaps Berlinguer may have suggested, but instead becoming a liberal and centrist party, fully caught up in the enthusiasm and neoliberal triumphalism that marked the period following the fall of the Berlin Wall. As Eric Hobsbawm memorably put it, the party threw out the baby and kept the bath water. In his 1974 article, Io so, I know, Pier Paolo Pasolini had identified the PCI as a sort of country within a country, which at least claimed, despite his criticisms, to stand for a different set of moral values. An honest country in a dishonest country, a clean country in a dirty country, an intelligent country in an idiotic country, and so on. And he suggested that these two countries, the PCI and the rest of Italy, ought to enter into diplomatic relations. But the fall of the Berlin Wall didn't lead, as in Germany, to West swallowing East, but rather to the Italian communists themselves adopting the mantle of the liberal centre, hurried along by the collapse of the Christian Democrats and socialists in the corruption trials of 1992-4. So the mantra of creating a clean, honest, uncorrupt, modern Italy became the new focus of the no longer communist leaders of the PCI, allied to the, as I say, the liberal triumphalism that greeted the end of the Cold War and the birth of the European project. Okay, so there's a lot more I could say about what's happened since the demise of the PCI and in the forces that sought to recreate it. But I think that the take-home message really is that the PCI didn't just fail in the sense of encountering insuperable obstacles or perhaps replacing the end goal of socialist transformation with reformist ones. Rather, what happened is that as the party distanced itself from its original identity, from its history, and indeed from the future horizon of socialism, the kind of glue that had held together the rest of the party, held together its different souls, very quickly became unstuck. Whereas in the early post-war decades, it could be said that the PCI in many ways represented more than the sum of its parts, creating a sense of working class dignity, organization, a sense of the possibility of change that wouldn't have emerged just from kind of the particular struggles going on at the time added together. By the end of its life, the PCI instead represented quite the opposite. It was, in a sense, a kind of radicalization of ideas like the idea that the working class had died, that Italy was a backward country that needed Europe to say it, and so on. So while I think that there certainly are really interesting insights and examples that can be drawn from the PCI's history in terms of, you know, how do you build really mass politics, how do you make working class leaders, the party has in effect left a field of ruins on the Italian left today.
All right, thank you for that, David. So we're going to take a few questions for David. We'll try not to keep him awake for too long, but if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll try to get to a couple. And while you're doing that, just a reminder to press like, press subscribe. That's how we get these videos out to more people. And I should also say, while I'm waiting, that David has a great piece in the new edition of Catalyst describing the workers' trends that took on so much so much attention in the 1960s and 70s in Italy. And that's in the new Catalyst, and we will put out a link to it later. I'm going through some of these questions. All right, so there's 3 questions here that I could group together. Nathan Drake, so I'll just mention them all, then I'll kind of summarize it and put it a little bit more pointedly to you, David. So Nathan Drake mentions that the CIA funded the Christian Democrats to stop the PCI after winning the first election after World War II, from winning the first post-war election. Jules asked, what price did the communists the Communist Party pay for the Red Brigade's kidnapping of Aldo Moro. Another commenter asked what was the role of the US/CIA in Italian society with keeping the Italian Communist Party out of government in the post-war period. So I guess can you talk a bit about the strategy of tension and what role extra parliamentary violence played in the PCI's evolution and ultimately why it was never able to take power?
Okay, so I think that there's uh, uh, no doubt at all that the United States maintained a consistent campaign and effort to keep the PCI from being able to not only to take power, but even to share any kind of governmental responsibility at the national level. The first question, Nathan, was right in the sense that right from the 1948 election, there was heavy CIA funding for the Christian Democrats. In fact, you could look even before that to the initial occupation/liberation of Italy by the US and UK in 1943, 1944, in which the Americans, and in fact even worse, the British, are very involved in Italian democratic politics and basically in trying to re-establish the power of Christian Democrats and even various mafiosi at the local level in southern Italy, but kind of more, I'd say, seeking to maintain sort of stability than necessarily seeking to prevent the communists being in government at all costs. Up till May 47, the communists are in a coalition government with the Christian Democrats and liberals and so on. However, it's certainly true that Italy became or in a sense, the central post-Cold War battleground, in the sense that if we look at countries like Greece and so on, obviously where the left was stronger and closer to taking power, then there was a full force reaction, military dictatorship, and that kind of thing. And it's also true that if you look at strategy of tension, the CIA are involved on both sides, both in the sense of their ties to stay-behind groups like Operation Gladio, which basically planned to create a paramilitary resistance in case the communists ever took power by force or the Soviet Union invaded. And also there's a certain amount of CIA involvement in ultra-left terrorist groups, including the Red Brigades. That said, I'm not sure what precise causal power I would grant that, in the sense that, the Communist Party's strategy was basically premised on it winning a democratic majority. And as I say, it made significant progress towards that end. And I think its failings have more to do with its own inability to turn the situation to its own advantage, in particular in the period of the historic compromise, because basically you have this wage freeze, you have the Christian Democrats no longer able to govern alone, and the communists basically aren't able to move the economic policy discussion, which is basically central, to the left at all. So the Red Brigade's killing of Aldo Moro, which I certainly wouldn't accept is necessarily a result of some sort of CIA hand, that not only undermines but leads to the ending of the historic compromise, because Aldo Moro was a centrist Christian Democrat leader who in the early 60s had brought the socialists into government with the Christian Democrats. He hoped eventually to do the same with the communists, kind of integrate but also pacify them. And killing him strengthened the hand of right-wingers and Christian Democrats who were hostile to the deal with the communists. But at the same time, there's lots of other factors. If we look at the 48 election, the communists didn't have majority support of the population, because the resistance had made a significant impact on national life in lots of parts of the country, But at the same time, there were many millions of Italians who basically didn't support the resistance, or at least were like passive or not involved, who were dominated by a Catholic political culture and by the interests of small business and so on, and who basically weren't interested in what the communists have to say. So although I think it's the CIA and American foreign policy involvement is very real, I wouldn't grant it an all-powerful influence. I mean, we could also look at, for example, the French Communist Party did enter government together with Francois Mitterrand in 1981, had a very weak influence on the government and was basically pushed out. So although certainly Kissinger was more worried about the Italian case, I think it's not necessarily the case that it would have been impossible for the historic compromise to have been achieved.
Just because you didn't do it, can you mention some of those books you were going to recommend?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the books because there are a few books in English about the PCI that are really worth reading, and some of them are available from Verso, which were hard to get recently, but have just come out again in paperback. So one of those is the Tailor of Ulm by Lucio Magri, which is a reflection on the party's history written after its demise by a member of the dissident group I mentioned, Il Manifesto. And this book, the author says it's not a history of the PCI, but basically, for want of anything else in English, it's the closest thing we have, at least from 1944 onwards. There's another Verso title worth reading, for a more colourful picture of organising in the party, is called Letters from Inside the Italian Communist Party to Louis Althusser by Maria Antonietta Macciocchi. As well as various works on Antonio Gramsci, the best of which is Giuseppe Fiori's biography, Antonio Gramsci, Life of a Revolutionary. There's some interesting works on Togliatti's leadership. There's a biography by Aldo Agosti, Palmiro Togliatti, a biography. Then there's a work more on the kind of foreign policy and the relation of the party to Moscow, which is Moscow and the Italian Communist Party by Joan Barth Urban. From a more kind of critical perspective, focused on the left-wing current of the party, loosely grouped around Pietro Ingrao, an interesting title is Grant Amyot's study, The Italian Communist Party, The Crisis of the Popular Front Strategy.
I think several years back, David wrote something for Jacobin on Ingrao, which you could check out in the Jacobin archives. Unless I'm misremembering, was it someone else?
Yes, he died in 2015.
2015, right. And also, obviously, Chris Maisano did a Jacobin YouTube talk about a month ago on the politics and theoretical legacy of Antonio Gramsci. So everyone should check it out. It's right on this channel. And I mentioned Chris because Chris just texted me with a question too. On the US left, he asked, the PCI and the Second International, particularly the SPD in Germany, tend to be depicted as more of a network of social and cultural organizations than an electoral formation or an integral part of the labor movement. What role did these social and cultural organizations actually play in the PCI's overall strategy, and how did it relate to the other aspects of the party's practical activity?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things we have to recognize about the PCI is that it gave rise to an incredible variety of cultural expressions, whether that means at the level of kind of like reviews, in the sense of kind of like literature reviews and that kind of stuff, as in journals and magazines, not as in just book reviews. And also, we can look at things like, like filmmakers and writers who are more or less aligned to the party. That wasn't necessarily the product of some sort of centrally defined strategy, but really, I think has more to do with the fact that in the if you look at the kind of young intellectuals who maybe reached their early 20s towards the end of the fascist regime, they strongly gravitated towards the Communist Party during the period of the resistance, and that gave it a very impressive sort of bedrock of support, even in kind of really genuinely like mass culture, like obviously film in the 40s more than TV is a genuinely mass medium. But I mean, it's hard to quantify the exact influence of like the sort of different forms of culture. But I think what we can say is that there was certainly like a lot of social life around the PCI, which was, to not necessarily at the avant-garde, but perhaps well in step with popular tastes. There's an interesting article we published a couple of years ago on disco and Italian communism by Ivan Pagliani, if I remember rightly, which was basically that, which pokes fun in a quite amusing way at the way in which the PCI reacted to Saturday Night Fever and the sorts of music and so on, which it thought were sort of enlightening and uplifting of the human soul, and those of which it thought were kind of consumerist trash, which is a quite common, like I think in a sense could be said to be a quite common element of sort of third international ideas on the arts, a certain idea that like, like in East Germany and so on, sort of making the masses of people learn to love classical music, it sort of raises the cultural level. But one thing I was responding to Chris's question as well is that although it's true that these kind of initiatives were not like centrally planned and organized, the PCI is in no sense just a sort of collection of different activities, because ultimately in a political and organizational sense, it was very strongly hierarchical. Like even if they sought to have organization in every village, in every street, and this kind of thing, ultimately that conformed to a very top-down and hierarchical structure, including indeed without things like internal elections and so on. So although the party was a lot more open than other communist parties, it was not very democratic in the sense of competitive elections and that kind of stuff.
Since Chris brings it up, I'm just wondering whether you see any parallels between pre-war social democracy like the SPD and the PCI's predicament. So kind of due to bourgeois power and just intense opposition to the workers' movement, the Second International were kept in a place of basically permanent opposition. And then on the other hand, due to the Cold War, the PCI were forced into a party of opposition, which allowed it to avoid tensions between reformists and revolutionaries within. It never had, at least, I guess that's probably overstating it, but never had to grapple with any of the contradictions of social democracy, of governing the bourgeois state.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the comparison is well taken, because firstly, because it's true that in both cases, the fact that they weren't really able to secure governmental power, in the SPD's case, of course, because pre-World War I, Germany didn't have equal voting for working class people, because they weren't really able to enter national government. They were able to maintain a certain ambiguity. Of course, another element of that is that the kind of apparently like kind of gradualist or reformist practice of these parties, which might be better described as actually sort of building up working class institutions sort of certainly outside of state control, even if they may be sort of somehow funded by the state or whatever. The problem of those kind of initiatives is that they're very good at building working class connection to a party and its rootedness in sort of everyday life. Like if we think of things like consumer cooperatives, or perhaps things like health advice or that kind of stuff. But then obviously the problem with that is that once you achieve it as something which the state provides, then the party no longer needs to provide it, because the party will always be less able to provide it on a genuinely mass scale than something which mobilizes the resources of the sort of general population. So I think also if you look at the SPD in the 20s, after it had entered government, that kind of grassroots activity is also greatly weakened simply because the party no longer needs to provide it.
Right. There's no need for an alternative society if workers now have the consumption, the buying power to enter and transform, through just a more democratic, mass consumer society. But all right, let me see. There's one question. I'm not sure whether you want to touch this. It's about it's from George Stapleton. Could David say something about the attitude of the Italian Communist Party, the workers' movement of the late 60s and 70s, and the general question of autonomia? Sounds like someone trying to trigger you. It sounds like someone who's already read your Catalyst piece, but if you want to give a summary, if you want to go in, I want to hear some classic Broder rant. Is it too late? Are you tired? Can you go in?
No, it's not too late. 1 in the morning is the perfect time for such an intervention, I believe. So, I mean, I think if we look at the workers' movement of the late 1960s and until some mid 70s, is extraordinarily impressive. I can't remember the exact figure, or I think it's 1969. I think there's 440 million lost strike days of work lost to strike action, or hours, whatever. So, like enormous strike waves, and it's certainly true that there was a very militant shop floor movement in that period. And it's also true that the PCI was quite slow to really get on board with that. This is something I talk about in the Catalyst article, precisely because of the kind of confrontations I mentioned in the 1950s. We think of things like May Day rallies being broken up by police and killing lots of people, or it's even hard just to get the constitutional right, like we want to hold a meeting without it being broken up by police or them saying we need a permit, which we don't need. The PCI's culture is very strongly focused on we are the party of the constitution, of democracy, of our rights. And also because of the fact that a lot of its leading militants, and particularly if we think of say local organists and so on, particularly because they're from often very modest working class backgrounds, there's a real sense of kind of the working class sort of made good, sort of respectable and upstanding. And in the party's own self-conception, that is counterposed to the kind of historic forms of the labor movement, or sort of forms of social revolt in Italy, not necessarily just the workers' movement, where there were local uprisings or kind of forms of revolt that were kind of big upsurge of popular activity, but which really have no chance of making lasting positive effect on national politics. So the PCI is very wary of that kind of struggle. And in the movements of the late 60s, and in fact, even starting in the early 60s, say 1962, I think really is the key year, you have a lot, because of the very rapid development of Italian capitalism, you have millions of Southern workers who really aren't well socialized in the PCI's traditions, who are entering activity for the first time, and often the forms of struggle are much more militant and confrontational and violent than would have been typical of the PCI of the time. And the fact that the PCI responds to this with a mix of kind of a mix of outright hostility, but also probably more a kind of quite patronizing approach, you don't really understand what you're doing, but come on board and we'll show you the right path. The fact that the PCI basically doesn't respond to the forms, or indeed the culture of those movements, means that they become one of the main focuses of organizing of currents further to the left of the PCI. So, which includes operaismo. It's probably best to point readers to the article than explain that in depth, but really actually the bigger organized force of the moment are organizations like Lotta Continua or Potere Operaio, which Tony Negri is one of the leading figures in, and then the other big one, well, I say big, these are organizations of thousands or tens of thousands of members. The Communist Party has 1.5 million, but of course also it's true that they were less they were less sort of full-time or less like militants, if you see what I mean. They were more like members of a party than necessarily engaged in the same way. So, it's certainly true that the PCI allowed itself to be outflanked to the left somewhat in that sense. But that said, I mean, ultimately by like 1971, I think that movement in the factories, in the sense of that movement being like in angular opposition to the PCI, I think that's basically over, because the party does move behind the wage demands. But I mean, we can talk about the political traditions of autonomia. I would say that that kind of politics is like vastly exaggerated in its in the significance it had then. I think that is vastly exaggerated by the kind of media and academic profile of various of the people from that tradition, and also from certain sort of violent clashes, which are held to be the sort of highlights of the history of the post-war Italian workers' movement. I think, although certainly some of the criticisms of the PCI from the left were at times correct, it's also true that a lot of the leading figures, and particularly the intellectuals who are considered to in some way sort of represent or embody that sort of proletarian revolt and rage, were themselves socially distant from it, and didn't really, I don't think, contribute to the left in a sort of enduring or lasting way. What I'd also say is that when the PCI killed itself, changed its name, moved to the liberal centre, a lot of its leaders became the avatars of sort of Italian neoliberalism, some from further left as well. What's, I think, been shown is that it's not like there's this kind of party bureaucracy weighing down the working class revolt, and then once that bureaucracy is like lifted out of the way, then the energies from below sort of surge up. That really hasn't happened. And if we look at the effects of the demise of the PCI, it's been really disastrous for the entire left, because it's just spread demoralization, disorganization, basically.
So just a couple quick questions we'll get to. On kind of a related note to what you were just saying, how popular was Eurocommunism in Italy, Jose asks, among the militants in comparison to the leadership? So was there actually some sort of adoption of Eurocommunist theory by rank and file PCI members, or was this really just a turn that happened at the levels of the bureaucracy of the party?
Well, I mean, one of the things to be said is that it's not like it was very clear in advance where Eurocommunism would lead, or what it in fact meant. In particular, we might note that, like, if I think I mentioned this in I wrote an article about Eric Hobsbawm and Italy, is that when he interviews Giorgio Napolitano in 1977 and brings up Eurocommunism, of which Hobsbawm has a pretty positive view, seeing the PCI as an alternative to the Soviet model and so on, Napolitano resists the use of the term Eurocommunism, because Eurocommunism is a negative and external characterization of the PCI's stance. And Berlinguer very much justified his own approach in terms of past reference points, in fact, particularly from Togliatti, even more than Gramsci, looking at the kind of wartime anti-fascist alliance. So, I mean, I think that it's true that, I mean, obviously, the Italian party was something different from the Soviet model, and over time they grew further and further apart, basically because the legitimacy of the Soviet Union turned from being a positive thing for the PCI in like the moment of liberation in 1945 to eventually becoming rather an albatross. That said, the contradiction there is that the initial decision to make the Communist parties adopt a more sort of national, patriotic register was to begin with kind of part of Comintern strategy from 1934, the Seventh Congress of the Comintern, to so that, and then the dissolution of the Comintern in '43, and the Stalin leadership of the Comintern, the communist parties to follow their own national paths. So like that's something that's always there in the PCI, the sense of having a very different national culture. But then again, that's something all communist parties would claim to have. Yet it's certainly true that over time, the Communist Party of the Italian Communist Party moved in a more in a direction of outwardly seeking alliance with the Christian Democrats and so on. That, of course, met with some skepticism and doubt. But then again, there's no like organized opposition to it. If we take, say, earlier we mentioned a left-wing leader of the party, Pietro Ingrao, he was not an opponent of the historic compromise. He instead, this is actually also the verity of the PCI's debates, is that he accepts the general framing, but puts a kind of different spin on what the idea actually means. So you're like, well, of course, we engage with Catholic Italy, and at the same time, we need to create sort of more profound democratization of society and great democratic participation. So you see, the idea of engaging with Italians who are Catholics is almost uncontroversial, and at the end of the spectrum, the historic compromise can mean and distancing the party from the Soviet Union could mean just like a governmental pact with Christian Democrats, and indeed joining and indeed the Communist Party supporting NATO. I think that in particular was something that went down poorly among militants, but again, it's not something that there was a significant or organized resistance to.
So I should mention, by the way, that on Friday next Friday, a week from today, we have Peter Gower. That's who we have. I blanked in the intro, but we talked about the Migrant Plan, the LO wage earner fund proposal that would have, if enacted in its initial form, have socialized Sweden by now, and we could have talked about the socialist 1/500th of the world, but it didn't work. But now that basics of that plan is obviously getting new relevance with various plans that came out of both the Bernie Sanders and the Jeremy Corbyn campaigns. So we're just going to get to two more questions. One of them you could definitely skip because it's mine and takes us on a tangent. So I'll start with that one maybe. Can you just briefly discuss or describe, just for people not familiar with it, the Italian Socialist Party? So obviously programmatically for a time it was quite left-wing on paper. It was further left than a lot of center-left parties, but it obviously had a tense relationship with the communists, and later on just become mired into the worst corruption scandals imaginable. So what was the Italian Communist Party? Was it always just this cynical thing, or did it have real, anti-Stalinist militants in it at some point?
Well, the
Socialist
Italian,
Party,
yeah, sure. So the Italian Socialist Party was from the period of basically what we're talking about, the period of World War II onwards, very weak, because it was greatly subordinate to the Communist Party. So like in the first post-war elections, the communists and socialists ran on a joint ticket, the Democratic Popular Front. So although the Socialist Party had actually got more votes than the communists in the first Constituent Assembly elections in '46, it soon falls behind, and also at the level of kind of membership, workplace implantation, and so on, it's very significantly weaker. Also, it has the particularity that because the Christian Democrats are so strong, because of its weakness relative to the communists, it actually maintains a quite odd position in terms of not being a anti-communist party throughout the kind of 50s, 60s, and in fact repeatedly splits with its further right-wing elements forming various sort of social democratic or so-called socialist Labour or social workers parties to the right, and which do enter government with the Christian Democrats. So the Socialist Party, though, did have some sort of moments in the sun. In particular, so what I meant by that, sorry, is that it remains so subordinate to the Communist Party and so unable to like sort of surpass it that right until the early 80s, the logo of the Socialist Party is like a hammer and sickle on an open book. And it's sort of unwilling to sharply criticize the Soviet Union, except at like strong moments of, like the invasion of Hungary in '56 and so on. But then, for a counterexample, when Stalin died, Sandro Pertini, who was the former partisan, became the socialist president in the late '70s. He gave an emphatic parliamentary speech praising Stalin's genius. That said, the Socialist Party did develop into part of government coalitions with, I mentioned earlier, because of Aldo Moro. So from '63, the Socialists are government, and again at the end of the '60s, early '70s. I don't know quite the year actually. And the Socialists did have some like real legislative achievements. You could question how advanced they really were relative to the workers' movement at the time, but then again, they're exactly the kind of things that the Italian labour movement is now repeatedly sort of fighting to save now. So, like in 1970, the Socialists pushed through a workers' statute, so-called, which makes it very hard to sack workers and companies of a certain size, grants all kind of guarantees and benefits and so on. And also it should be said, although now or certainly the last 3 decades, the Italian party system has been very strongly sort of focused on the figure of the prime minister and the executive. There was a certain, perhaps we could say in the '60s, '70s, there was a certain ability for even quite minor parties to sort of push through some of their legislation. But what you're referring to with the corruption is that in the '80s, from 1983, Bettino Craxi became the prime minister, a socialist, although his parliamentary majority was mainly dependent on Christian Democrats. He was the first socialist prime minister, and he played a very important role in Silvio Berlusconi's takeover of basically for Berlusconi being allowed to run private television networks, which had been a state monopoly till then, and also because the Socialist Party takes part in the sort of carve up of the state and of tenders in the final years of what's called the First Republic, so basically the '80s, and the corruption scandals of 1992 to '94 are very heavily focused on figures like from the Socialist Party, including Craxi, who fled to Tunisia rather than he actually did stand trial for a bit and then fled. But yeah, so I mean, the Socialist Party sort of ended in total infamy and no longer exists. But I think it's not fair to say that it was only what it became in its final years.
So let's end with one more question. It's a question that notes the decentralized nature of the Italian socialist movement in the 1910s compared to the different organization that began to build in the 1920s. The question is, what do you think the American left could learn from the experience involved with building the Communist Party regarding centralism and localism?
Centralism and
localism.
Localism.
Yes.
Well, I mean, it's difficult because in a sense, the particular organizational forms couldn't be reproduced. Part of the problem is that the PCI relied on a kind of collectivist culture of sort of the mass of members fairly passively accepting the party line and not being able to have a direct say in lots of the decisions taken, which certainly doesn't seem very attractive as an organizational model. At the same time, I think that there are more positive elements of the PCI, particularly when it comes to thinking about how do we create a mass party which isn't just like the party of its members who decide what they want to do, but rather like actively seeks to make itself a party of the working class, or let's say of subaltern populations in general. And obviously those aren't the same things. Of course, I'll admit that that can also be a very right-wing critique, like often say during the Sanders, or certainly during the Corbyn project, and you see some of the same with Sanders too. You get this kind of thing, well, the activists, like, what do they know? They don't say what ordinary people think. So I think there's a tension between, it's a tension. It's something which constantly has to be grappled with. But I think it is very important to reflect on the PCI success in terms of taking people from parts of the working class, or let's say the lower or exploited class of Italian society, who like have very low like educational or cultural capital, and turning them into public faces and organizers. And I think like that kind of thing is useful. In terms of localism, that's a difficult question, also because in the Italian case, like having kind of good territorial roots isn't necessarily the same thing as having local autonomy. By way of example, like if you think of the Italian Socialist Party that preceded the Communist Party, very often its representatives in parliament would sort of play a game at that time quite typical of Italian bourgeois politics, where the local MP would basically be a kind of champion for local interests, and they would effectively enmesh themselves with local elites and stand up for them in parliament, like, oh, we'll vote for such and such thing if you give us a bridge, that kind of politics. Or, in basically, because the South was seen as underdeveloped, the Italian Socialist Party leadership of that time basically thought it was kind of okay if socialists in the south of Italy entered into weird combinations with like Freemasons and anti-clerical types. And basically because of the assumption that it would be impossible ever to build up organization in the most difficult areas to organize. So part of the strength of having a centralized national organization with a common program, like for the whole country, is that it somehow allows you to overcome some of the logics that exist in local politics in terms of, the like projects or the kind of horse trading, whatever that might exist there. And at the same time, it's also important in the sense that, I mean, certainly looking at the history of the Italian left, like if we talk about the first decade of the 20th century, most working class people would be illiterate. So if you talk about like local autonomy, that effectively meant local leaders doing what they like. So I think there's a lot to be said for having a sort of galvanizing national project, which also doesn't condemn sort of local militants to only have to organize with the people who they happen to live near.
All right. Well, to everyone watching, please press like, press subscribe, check out David's work. There's a lot of links in the description. And please subscribe to Jacobin in print. It's how we keep on the lights. And thanks again, David. When this pandemic is over, I hope we can, get together and share an Aperol Spritz or something together soon. And to everyone watching, tune in again tomorrow, 1 p.m. for Weekends, Anna Kasparian, Michael Brooks. But good night and have a good weekend, everyone.